All right, YouTube, this is Trace HPTV coming to you with another video. We got to talk about this Martin Luther King files. Now, you got Al Sharpton and the King family. They outraged that these files have been released instead of the Epstein files. And I want to really talk to you now about the Martin Luther King files and why people on the left are outraged about the release of those documents. Now, Martin Luther King was under heavy surveillance through the Department of Justice and J. Edgar Hoover. They followed his every movement, listened to every phone call. And it was done under the Democratic Party's initiative. It was John F. Kennedy and Bobby Kennedy that actually put J. Edgar Hoover on surveilling Martin Luther King. The Democratic Party had the unions through Joseph Kennedy, John F. Kennedy's father, who was a bootlegger. And the mob controlled the union, so they were able to get the union vote. But they also needed the black vote. And before King, no Democratic politician had ever took the rostrum and been in front of black leadership as if they were a co-partner. They needed King to infiltrate the civil rights movement. And they did it through blackmail. They did it through threatening King with exposure. They knew certain things about King's personal lifestyle, and they used these things to sway him. They had him between J. Edgar Hoover and Kennedy's. He would run to the Kennedys for help as it related to J. Edgar Hoover, not realizing that the Kennedys were the ones who put J. Edgar Hoover to task with following his every movement and surveilling him. Now, they did that because they wanted Martin Luther King to be the face of what they wanted to see in the civil rights movement, which means initially the Democratic Party took over the civil rights movement. That's why when they actually did sign the bill, Lyndon B. Johnson said, we'll have these Negroes voting Democrat for the next 200 years. And this is why they use King's name and his legacy to strike the emotions of black people, because they have an affinity for King. They have affinity for what he stood for. They have affinity for who his family was as preachers down in the South. But what you're going to see in these files is that the Democratic Party was using King. And toward the end of his life, he actually said that he was integrating his people into a burning house, and that the white liberal was one of the biggest threats to the upward mobility of black people. And then once he started speaking against the war in Vietnam, he became a bigger threat because he was starting to not want to be blackmailed. He was starting to go against the narrative. He was saying, well, just if you're going to expose me, expose me. So now his legacy is at risk when people go into the salaciousness of his lifestyle. But the bigger picture and why it was released is so that the masses of black people can see the duplicity of the Democratic Party and how they used this man until he couldn't be used no more. So you have Al Sharpton come out, and he said it's a distraction from the Epstein list. Do you really think Trump has to distract you from the Epstein list? All they have to do is just don't ever release it. And then what are you going to do? You're going to go on for the next 10 years saying you want to see what's on the Epstein's list, the flight logs. You know, because I know people always want a good story, but you're missing something else, because all of these things are sometimes distractions. The counterintelligence program, when they talk about exactly what they did to King, how they tried to almost force him into suicide, is telling, because you still see the Democratic Party acting as if they're for the civil rights of black people when they have already became the party of the LGBT community and immigrants. So without further ado, let's look into this clip. It's for fair use under the 1976 Copyright Act for education and commentary. Check this out.
Now, as you mentioned at the top of the show, Joe, the White House, which has seized control of the White House press pool, has now banned the Wall Street Journal from the travel pool from the president's upcoming trip to Scotland this weekend. He's going to go golfing at some of his golf courses. So there is some real anger there, and they're trying to distract by throwing so much up against the wall, including more than 200,000 pages of documents related to the assassination and FBI surveillance of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Those were declassified and released to the public yesterday. The documents had been under seal by a court since 1977, when they were first handed over to the National Archives and Records Administration. The massive document dump includes DOJ leads into Dr. King's assassination. It's not immediately clear if the files include any new information on Dr. King's life or murder. The King family was opposed to the public release of the records. They were given advanced access to the documents, but in a lengthy statement, asked anyone from the public also combing through the files to, quote, do so with empathy, restraint, and respect for the family's continuing grief. Bernice King, the daughter of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., posted this picture on social media with the caption that simply reads, "Now do the Epstein files." And Reverend Sharpton, this one, there have been some promises early in the administration that eventually they would release files into the MLK assassination. They already released some into the JFK assassination. It was a pretty partial batch. More promise. They might turn to Robert F. Kennedy Sr. At some point, too. But this is what's striking about this one is the family really didn't want it. They didn't want the wound to be opened again. They didn't want any sort of embarrassing information to come out. They simply were like, we've moved on, the nation's moved on. And they're flat out saying, what a lot of us are suspecting here, this is simply an attempt to change the conversation from the Epstein matter, but also other things that are really dragging down the president's approval ratings.
No, this is clearly a distraction. The fact of the matter is, they say you're going to release over 200,000 pages. Goes possibly beyond the assassination. And the concern the family has had, and I work closely with Martin III, is that there was a lot in that file, possibly by J. Edgar Hoover and others, who clearly were anti-Dr. King, yes, had a bias. It has been well documented that J. Edgar Hoover and others had put out stories that were false about Dr. King. If these are now put out in the documents as truth, because people decades later do not understand what J. Edgar Hoover's FBI was like, what it was trying to do to the civil rights movement and Dr. King, you could smear a man in your attempt to just distract us from what's going on today. So let me get this right. You can bring files out that's been under seal since 77 that were not even supposed to be released now until a couple of years from now. But you can't bring out files on Epstein. I mean, does he think the American public is that stupid? So you go after so-called Native Americans. You're saying they're not Native Americans. You go after Obama. You go after King. So you throw all the race stuff and then the other stuff, anything that try to distract. And I think that the King family was right to try to protect the name of the Dr. King, particularly if these are using some of Hoover's lies. But at the same time, I think Bernice King is right saying, what about the Epstein files? Don't try to smear my father. Let's deal with today's agenda.
You know, Rev, it's very interesting you're talking about Martin Luther King Jr. being smeared. It's already really happened over the past 40, 50 years where you've had these rumors that have leaked out and these personal smears against Dr. King that have leaked out when, again, as a lot of legal scholars have been saying for some time and even said to the New York Times yesterday after this news broke, that a lot of these smears are probably false, and probably false because J. Edgar Hoover despised Martin Luther King. FBI agents were sent, you talk about a witch hunt, sent on a witch hunt to attack him, to put personal things into fire.
Now, I just want to interject right there because he says that the FBI was sent on a smear hunt. Who could actually send the FBI at Martin Luther King? They're saying the quiet part out loud. And that's the real story behind why they are saying that it's a distraction. They don't want you to see exactly what they did to King, while at the same time they uses his name to play on your emotions when they were actually the ones working against King.
Try to prove that he was a communist. So there are a lot of things that have been out there, even in popular culture, for a very long time now, that are likely untrue because, again, Hoover basically ordered his FBI agents to go out and find dirt on Martin Luther King.
No doubt about it. And in fact, they sent tapes. I remember Mrs. King telling us how they sent tapes to the house of Dr. King, to Mrs. King, supposedly with all kind of salacious stuff on the tapes, which was false. And telling Dr. King another letter, you know what to do, like suggesting he remove himself from public life. So these are the things they want released now to the public, so some of our conspiracy theorists on the other side start bringing out things that have been discredited 40, 50 years ago, and to bring that kind of pain on the King family. A granddaughter who he never lived to see is just so unfair and outrageous at this time.
Yeah, President Trump finds himself in the unusual position of not being on the right side of the culture wars, not being ahead of it, and he's trying. It looks like, with all of that great list that you had up just a second ago, that we had up of all the things he's posting about, it looks like he's just trying to get back in front of the culture wars into a position he's more familiar with. We'll have more on that, of course, coming up on the program.
As you can see, they saying the quiet part out loud. They don't want people to see the type of evidence and the type of things they were using to blackmail King, to sway King, and to control King. This is why they were sending the tapes to his house. All this is kind of really old news. But it being released for the public to see, it will break your affinity to think that the Democratic Party were the friends of Martin Luther King. They were not. They were the ones who unleashed Hoover on Dr. King to control him, to control the civil rights movement, and to ultimately control the mentality and the voting bloc of the black community and the masses. And to this day, you still are attached to the Democratic Party. You still trust them when they've been snakes all along. Who was the president when J. Edgar Hoover and the Department of Justice were after King? It was the Kennedys. It was the Democrats. It was those liberals. And Martin Luther King realized that he was being used too late. So now these files are relevant for history's sake. And it may hurt the family a little bit because Martin Luther King's position as far as being a reverend is going to come into question. But it will ultimately show you the duplicitousness and the nefariousness of the Democratic Party. Well, this is Detroit's HPTV. It's all I have for you on this topic. And it would do you good to read these files yourself since they've been released. So signing out to you out Detroit's HPTV. Keep your head on the swivel. As always, salute to all patriots. Like, share, and subscribe. Peace.